knowledge that we are going to gain during this lecture will be necessary when you do the nerve tracks in the spinal cord and in the brain stem. So pay a special focus on that aspect when I do it. Okay. Now, we have already dealt with the concept of central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And we have learned that the central nervous system mainly includes the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system includes mainly the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. And with that, you can actually add to it the sympathetic chains, autonomic ganglia, especially parasympathetic autonomic ganglia, because when you say sympathetic chain, the sympathetic ganglia are included in the sympathetic chain. And then you get the parasympathetic ganglia close to the organs. They supply O on the wall of the organs. So they also are included in the peripheral nervous system. Then you have various nerve plexus in the gut and even outside, formed by the spinal nerves. So those are all included under the peripheral nervous system, whatever that is outside the central nervous system. We know that. Then you have, I heard that you have learned the development of the nervous system. I will touch a small part of the development because that is related to my discussion today. Now, during the development of the nervous system, which starts very early, one of the first systems to start its development, immediately after the trilaminar disc is formed in the 3rd week of intrauterine life, as early as that, the neural tube is formed from the neuroectoderm on the dorsal aspect of the ectoderm. A special germ layer develops from the ectoderm, which is the neuroectoderm, and the neuroectoderm will form a tube. And the innermost layer of the tube is the neuroepithelial cell layer, and this cell layer proliferates and forms cells to its outside. And after some time, you can identify 2 layers formed around the cavity in the middle. The outer layer is called marginal layer, and the inner layer is called mental layer. Now, I always, personally, I always forget the 2 names. Okay, so don't worry about the names much. It's not the names you understand. You should understand, what is going on. Okay, names you can learn later if you want to. You can forget. Then these 2 layers, marginal layer and mental layer, with further development, the center, there's a central canal now in the middle. The center of the central canal, a sulcus develops. You can see the sulcus that has developed, which is called sulcus limitans. Okay. And this sulcus limitans, if you draw a plane across the sulcus limitans like that, you see that the inner plate, the ala plate, the mental layer, sorry, inner layer, the mental layer that has been formed is divided into 2 halves, anterior half and a posterior half, by this sulcus, the plane passing through the sulcus limitans. Now, this is a very important point. Now, based on the sulcus limitans, you can see that the anterior half of the mental layer is now called basal plate, and the posterior half is now called ala plate. Posterior half is called ala plate. Now, the basal plate is going to produce motor neuron and motor neurons. Okay, motor cell bodies, and the ala plate, the posterior half, is going to produce sensory nerve cell bodies. Okay, so that's the basic rule. Then, if you go into further details of that, further away, now if you take the anterior half motor, posterior half sensory, that's understood. Then further away, if you take the anterior half, further away from the center, the sulcus limitans plane, you get the somatic motor cells. Now, these are somatic motor cells. Somatic motor means the motor neurons that supply the skeletal muscles. Okay. Then again, in the posterior plate, the ala plate, the further away from the central plane again, you get somatic sensory cells. Somatic sensory neurons. Somatic sensory neurons. Then Very close to the midline on either side, you get the autonomic cells. In front, again the same rule, you get autonomic motor, then immediately behind you get autonomic sensory. Okay, so this is the general arrangement in the neural tube. So this basic structure can be found in the spinal cord. That's why I mentioned it. Now, when it comes to the brain stem, where you get most of the cranial nerves arising from 3rd to the 12th cranial nerves, they arise from the brain stem. And there also you get the same rule applied to some extent, but because of the changes that take place during the development of the brain and the brain stem, certain things have changed. The exact picture is not there, but you can get an idea if you know this exact picture. Later, what happens is we will discuss that when the brain stem is formed, this splits here, okay, and this opens up like that. Okay, so you get the 4th ventricle. You remember the 4th ventricle like this with the roof open. In the sense, there's a covering, but open in the sense that you don't get brain substance there with cells and all. Okay, so because of that, there are changes taking place, but the basic rule you have to remember to understand that also. But when it comes to the spinal cord, this rule is very nicely applied view with only few differences, if at all. Okay. So then if you take the same basic thing again, forward here, I'll take this to that side. Okay, so you have this arrangement now. Posteriorly, you have the sensory. Anteriorly, you have the motor. Then further away, you have the somatic, motor, and sensory. Very close to the midline, you have the visceral or autonomic sensory and visceral motor, autonomic motor. Okay. Then, if you draw the spinal cord parallel to this, now this is how the spinal cord looks like. Now you always remember the plane in the center. Okay, in your mind, you don't forget the plane in the center. Okay, so there's a plane like that in the center, which is across the sulcus limiter. So don't forget that. Then, if you look at this, you can see that you have white matter outside, which is formed by the outer layer. Okay, the marginal layer. And inside you get the gray matter formed by the mantle layer. So there we divided it into anterior half and a posterior half. You know this because you have done the development. Then now if you think of a reflex arc, you know what are reflex arcs? Okay, Pratika Chapa. If you think of a reflex arc, in a reflex arc, a somatic reflex, in a somatic reflex arc, you get the sensory nerve coming in. You can see the somatic sensory nerve coming in. These are axons of nerves coming in. It has its cell body outside the central nervous system in what you call the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion. Then the dendrites will remaining part of the nerve fiber enters the posterior side of the spinal cord and synapse with an interneuron. Okay, this is an interneuron. And then the interneuron connects up with the motor neuron, the cell body of which lies in the anterior side of the spinal cord. Now we'll come back to the structure of the spinal cord later. Okay, so you have this gray matter. You can see the posterior horn, lateral horn, and the anterior horn. So this lateral horn can be seen only in the thoracic and upper lumbar spinal segments. We'll come back to it, but for the moment, now that we have done the development part, we will concentrate on this one first. So this is the picture when it comes to somatic nerve arrangement. Okay, so you have a somatic sensory nerve entering, then you have an interneuron, then you have the motor neuron coming out. Okay. Then if you think of an autonomic or visceral nerve, in this area, thoracic and lumbar area, it's basically sympathetic you get, not parasympathetic. Then you can again see the visceral sensory nerve that is coming first here, visceral sensory nerve, just like the somatic sensory nerve, is having its first cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, together with the somatic sensory cell bodies. Then it has an interneuron. The cell body is very close to the central line, sulcus limitans plane here. Then you have the motor, autonomic motor nerve, or sympathetic motor in this case, the cell body starting in the lateral horn. So both these actually, they should start in the area of the lateral horn. Okay. So then you get the motor neuron, the autonomic neuron coming out together with the somatic motor neurons. So if you draw a nerve root here and nerve root there, you get both somatic and autonomic. Here you get sensory, this side you get motor. Okay. So then that is a point that you need to remember first. Then it's not always reflex arcs that you're dealing with. No? Okay, because certain sensations, most of the sensations go into the conscious level as well. So if it is somatic sensory, it will definitely go into the post-central gyrus, the sensory cortex of the brain, which is behind the central sulcus, which we discussed. So you have your brain here like that. You have the central sulcus. Your post-central gyrus is here. Okay, sensory cortex. So then when it comes to the autonomic ones, they will go into the autonomic centers. The main autonomic center is the hypothalamus. So they will go into the hypothalamus. Now remember this somatic sensory ones which come into the post-central gyrus, they don't directly come into the post-central gyrus. They will go into the thalamus, and then from there they will come. We will learn that when we do the ascending and descending nerve tracts later. Okay. Then similarly, when it comes to motor neurons, not that they always get inputs through reflexes. Okay, it's not the case. You get direct inputs coming from the precentral gyrus or the motor cortex. Your motor cortex is here in front of the central sulcus, and then you get those direct motor inputs coming into the motor neurons, somatic motor neurons here, and the impulses are taken to skeletal muscles. Similarly, you can have motor impulses generated in the hypothalamus, especially in the paraventricular nuclear areas. You don't have to know the details of that. And they will come down through the autonomic motor nerves, and they will synapse with the lateral horn, autonomic or visceral motor neuron cell bodies, and the impulses will go out through the anterior nerve root. So this is the basic arrangement in the spinal cord when it comes to the nerve pathways. Now this cross section. Now this is a cross section of the spinal cord. Cross section of the spinal cord. Try to learn the different structures, different parts in the spinal cord in this one. Now you have this posterior median. This phone call is disturbing. Let me. So this you get a posterior median septum here and an anterior median fissure. Then you get white matter outside and gray matter inside. So outside you get the nerve fibers, inside you get the nerve cells. You know this basic stuff already. Then if you look at the gray matter, especially in the thoracic and upper lumbar regions, if you take that area, you get the gray matter has three horns: the posterior horn, anterior horn, which are there in all spinal levels, and then in the thoracic and upper lumbar you get the lateral horns as well. Okay, and you know that the autonomic nerve cells, motor and sensory, they are concentrated in the lateral horn. Somatic motor ones are concentrated in the posterior horn, and the somatic sensory ones in the posterior horn, somatic motor ones in the anterior horns. And then in the center, you get the cavity, which is the central canal. So this basic stuff you should know. Then when it comes to other areas of the spinal cord, you will not have the lateral horn. You will not a visible lateral horn, but the autonomic cells, if they are there, they will be arranged in the area of the lateral horn. Now, when it comes to the, now, okay, we'll do that first. And if this is your brain, and if this is your brain stem, and this is your spinal cord, when it comes to autonomic nerve, output of nerves, you get parasympathetic coming out from the brain stem, and you get parasympathetic coming out from the sacral area. Okay, and the sympathetic comes out from the, this is parasympathetic, and the sympathetic comes out from the thoracic and upper lumbar regions. Okay, sympathetic. Therefore, you say that the parasympathetic has a craniosacral outflow. Okay, it's a cranio, here sacral outflow, and the sympathetic has a thoracolumbar outflow because it's thoracic and upper lumbar. So even if you take a section of the spinal cord here in the sacral area, or even the lower lumbar area, you will have parasympathetic nerve cells also arranged in the area of the lateral horn, but you don't see a visible lateral horn. That is the problem. Okay, a clear lateral horn is seen in the thoracic and upper lumbar segments, mainly the thoracic segments. Remember it as thoracic. Okay, so that is the point that I wanted to raise here. Then now your motor nerves come out as anterior nerve roots, and the sensory nerves enter the spinal cord as posterior nerve roots. Now, because of these anterior and posterior nerve roots, the white matter of the spinal cord is divided into 3 areas, so 3 columns. Okay. Now, the area of the white matter behind the posterior nerve root is called posterior white column. And the area of the white matter in front of the anterior nerve root, okay, is called the anterior white column. Anterior white column. And in between the anterior nerve roots and the posterior nerve roots, you get the lateral white column. Later, when you learn the nerve tracts, you will see that the nerve tracts, certain nerve tracts, they pass in the posterior white column. Certain other nerve tracts, they will pass in the lateral white column, and the remaining ones pass in the anterior white column. Okay, for that purpose, remember that point as well. Okay. Then, now these posterior nerve roots, they contain sensory axons. We have already discussed that, sensory axons, or you call them afferent, AFFERENT, afferent or sensory. This afferent term is very frequently used in textbooks. Okay, learn that. So sensory means afferent. So when we say afferent, it's both somatic and autonomic or visceral afferent. And the anterior nerve root, on the other hand, contains motor axons, both autonomic and somatic, and they are called efferent because they are going out. Afferent means coming in. Efferent means going out from the spinal cord. Then these anterior nerve roots and posterior nerve roots, they come and join. I'll join them here. They come and join here, and they form one nerve, which is called the spinal nerve. It is called mixed spinal nerve because it contains both. It's a combination of posterior and anterior nerve roots. And if you physically look at where this is happening, this joining, it happens inside. If you draw the vertebral canal here, if this is the vertebral canal, okay, this is the intervertebral foramen area. Okay, this is the intervertebral foramen area. This is the intervertebral foramen, this is the vertebral canal. So this is the other vertebra below. Okay, so this is the intervertebral canal, and immediately before this mixed spinal nerve is formed, you get the dorsal root ganglion here, almost within the intervertebral canal again. Okay, and this nerve is the spinal nerve, which is mixed. It's mixed in the sense it has somatic motor and autonomic somatic sensory, autonomic sensory. Then it also has somatic motor and autonomic motor. Okay, so there are 4 types of nerve fibers are there in the spinal nerves. Okay, so that's why it's called mixed spinal nerve. Then, if we discuss further about mixed spinal nerve, this is what I mentioned just now. Okay, the things that are inside the mixed spinal nerve. So the same thing from dorsal. Okay, from the dorsal and ventral nerve roots pass out through the intervertebral foramen. Okay, now then if you count the number of spinal nerves, ultimately you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. 31 pairs of spinal nerves. If you divide them into regions, you get 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. That makes it 31. Then now this is a diagram, nice diagram of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. Now, if you can learn a lot of things from this diagram, actually. Now, this is the anterior side. You can understand that. This is the anterior side. And you can see these are motor nerve roots, anterior nerve roots. These are posterior nerve roots. And you can see the dorsal root ganglion here. Okay. And you see the spinal nerves formed by the union of anterior and posterior nerve roots. Again, if you draw the vertebral column, you will get your intervertebral foramen somewhere here. Okay. Then the other point that you can learn from this diagram is that now all these spinal segments, say C5, C6, C7, whatever the spinal segment, it has a thickness. It has some thickness. You can clearly see the thickness here. Can you see the thickness here? So these nerve roots, they are all coming from one spinal segment. Okay, through that thickness, and then it forms the anterior nerve root. Okay, so these rootlets, you may be called. So then they will have both somatic and autonomic ones. The issue here is if you damage the spinal cord, say if you have a tumor or a fracture of the spinal cord, damaging only this part, okay, then you will only lose the motor part of that spinal segment, which is very rare. Okay, or if you damage only the sensory root here, you will only get loss of sensation from that dermatome. You know what is a dermatome? Okay, the area of skin from which the sensations are taken to the spinal nerve. But these injuries are very rare because you don't get so isolated injuries. When you get injuries, you might get an injury like that. Okay, damaging the nerve root and the spinal part of the spinal cord as well, or something like this. Okay, so depending on the injury, you get different pictures, or you might get an injury damaging this whole area, whole side of the spinal cord, or even the whole spinal cord. Okay, so based on that, you get different clinical pictures. Now the picture would be like this. Now in the picture, you will get certain signs when you elicit signs because you damage nerve pathways going up and down in the spinal cord. If the spinal cord is also damaged, at the same time, if the nerve roots are damaged, you get corresponding deficits based on the level of the spinal cord where the damage is taking place, which complicates the whole picture because you get sensory or motor deficits related to the spinal nerves as well as the nerve tracts going up and down. Okay, so motor and sensory both. So this is what you need to learn if you have not learned it already by physiology. Through physiology lectures, we will have to do it to some extent in anatomy, but it's mainly done by the physiology people. Okay. Then this is another picture to give you the same idea. You can see the dorsal root ganglion here. So the mixed spinal nerve is formed somewhere here. Okay, just distal to the dorsal root ganglion. Then once the nerve comes out, the spinal nerve comes out, it is connected to the sympathetic chain by two communicating small nerves. They are called, one is called white ramus communicant, the other one is called gray ramus communicant. I'll show you a different picture later. So they are connected. They connect the spinal nerves into the sympathetic chain. This is the sympathetic chain. Okay, there are two connections. Then immediately after that, the spinal nerves divides into an anterior ramus. We call it anterior primary ramus. Anterior primary ramus and posterior primary ramus. The posterior primary ramus will supply a small area, a strip of skin at the back and back muscles. Back muscles. Anterior ramus has a very wide supply compared to the posterior ramus. It supplies all your limb plexus and all your somatic skeletal muscles and the autonomic ones, the visceral structures are supplied by the anterior rami. They form plexus and all that you have learned. You have learned about brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, sacral plexus. All those are formed, cervical plexus. All those are formed by the anterior primary rami. Remember that point. Then you already know that when the spinal cord is inside the vertebral canal, you have the three coverings: dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, covering the spinal cord. And between pia mater and arachnoid mater, this one and this one, you get the subarachnoid space filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this is, I want to highlight the connection between the spinal nerve and the sympathetic chain. So this is the sympathetic chain, spinal nerve and sympathetic chain. Now, this is the basic arrangement of, I don't know whether I have enough here. Basic arrangement of autonomic nerves is this. Now, I'll draw it here. The basic arrangement of autonomic nerves, I will draw it here. Now, if this is the central nervous system, with this brain or spinal cord, it doesn't matter. You get a cell body in the spinal, the central nervous system, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, and that cell body has a nerve fiber coming like this, and there's a second cell body and a nerve fiber. Okay, here is a ganglion. Okay, now ganglia are collection of nerve cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Okay, so that's a ganglion. That's a ganglion. Now, this is called preganglionic. Preganglionic nerve fiber. This is called postganglionic. So that you have a preganglionic fiber and a postganglionic fiber. One before the ganglion is called preganglionic, one after the ganglion is called postganglionic nerve fiber. Now, when it comes to sympathetic nerves, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, they will have their preganglionic nerve fiber, cell body of the preganglionic nerve fiber in the central nervous system. Okay, so when it comes to the parasympathetic, you get these collections of cell bodies in the brain stem in relation to cranial nerves and in the sacral area. Okay, when it comes to the sympathetic nerves, you get them in the thoracic region and the upper lumbar region. I have already mentioned it. Okay, thoracolumbar outflow. Now, then when it comes to this ganglia, when it comes to the sympathetic nervous system, these ganglia are the ones that are found here in the sympathetic chain. Now, what happens is you get these ganglia and now you say you have a ganglion here, another ganglion here, another ganglion there. Now you get the preganglionic fiber coming like this. And this is the postganglionic fiber. Now what happens is some of these postganglionic fibers or preganglionic fiber, they go up and go out like that. Okay, or they go down and go out like that. Because of this, there is a connection formed between these ganglia. Otherwise, you will get separate chain of ganglia. Now, this connection is built because of these fibers going up and down. There are, if you type in the internet, you will see diagrams where you get these fibers going up and going out, and going down and going out like this. Okay, just type and see in the internet. So then this is how the sympathetic chain is formed due to the sympathetic ganglia. Those are the, now if somebody asked what is there inside the sympathetic ganglia, and you can say that it is the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons. Okay, postganglionic sympathetic neurons. So then, now you can see that the distance between the spinal cord and the sympathetic ganglia and the sympathetic chain is very limited. It's a very small distance. Because the reason is that the preganglionic fibers, because of this reason, the preganglionic fiber of the sympathetic system is shorter. Now, this one is short when it comes to the sympathetic system. On the other hand, when it comes to the parasympathetic system, you get the parasympathetic nerves starting from the central nervous system, and the preganglionic fiber has to go all the way to the organ. Now, if this is the eyeball, it supplies the eyeball, it has to go very close to the eyeball. Sometimes when it comes to organs like the GI tract, you get the ganglia. Now, if this is stomach, you get the parasympathetic ganglia on the wall of the organ that it is going to supply. So when it comes to parasympathetic, the preganglionic fiber is very long, and the postganglionic fiber is very short. Okay, quite opposite to the sensory system, the sympathetic system. Okay, remember this point. So then this, now you know the sympathetic chain, it's actually formed by the ganglia of the sympathetic chain. They are formed by the collection of postganglionic nerve cells, sympathetic nerve cells, and these are the rest of the chain is formed by the fibers traveling up and down. Okay, and there's another point here. Now here you see gray ramus and white ramus. Gray ramus and white ramus communicants. Now this is related to the two nerve connections that connect the sympathetic chain to the spinal nerve. Reason is the preganglionic fibers are myelinated. Therefore, they appear white. And the postganglionic autonomic fibers are non-myelinated. Okay, non-myelinated. Therefore, they have a gray appearance. Because of that, you call the ones that the ones that are coming from the spinal cord and going into the sympathetic chain, they are white. Okay, so input is white in that direction, and the output is gray. Okay, which is a very small point. Okay, don't go behind that. The first thing that I mentioned, the initial part of the slide, what I mentioned is more important than this point. Okay, then you can see you get the anterior primary ramus and the posterior primary ramus of the spinal nerve here. Okay, then the spinal cord is divided into 5 regions. Spinal cord is divided into 5 regions. So you get a cervical region, you get a thoracic region, lumbar region, sacral region, and a very small coccygeal region. Then from each you get spinal nerves coming out. We already said 8, 12, 5, 5, and 1. Altogether it's 31 spinal nerves, and they come out through the intervertebral foramina. You all know all that now. Then a very small point, we have already done meninges and meningeal spaces. Remember one point, now when these meninges, they cover the spinal cord, the arachnoid mater and dura mater, they invest, or they cover the anterior and posterior nerve roots and come up to the intervertebral foramen again. Many things are happening in the intervertebral foramen, and inside the intervertebral foramen, they merge with the epineurium, outermost covering of the epineurium of the spinal nerve. Okay, that's how they end. Up to that, they will come. Then the pia mater will end at somewhere here. Okay, they form what are called ligamentum denticulatum here. And they end. If you want, you can read last. It gives a good description about the pia mater, what happens to pia mater. Okay, so this much is enough for that. Then these spinal segments and spinal nerves, there's something that I want to tell you about spinal nerves and spinal segments. Now, even though you see the spinal nerves coming out, 8, 12, 5, 5, 1, if you look at the spinal cord, you don't see the spinal segments as such. You will have to imagine the spinal segments like this. Okay, so you, based on your based on the spinal nerves that are coming out, you can arbitrarily decide the spinal segments, because each spinal nerves come out from a spinal segment. Okay. Now this is an attempt to show you the spinal cord and the vertebral column. Now this line is the vertebral column. This is the spinal cord. Okay, so outside you get the vertebral column. You can see the C1 vertebra, C2, C3, C4 like that. Then on the right side, you see in yellow color the respective spinal segments. Now you already know that the spinal cord ends at L1 lower border. Okay, L1 lower border. So the vertebral column I have only drawn up to L1. Okay, but remember that below that you have the vertebral column. It continues as L2, L3, L4, L5, then the sacral area. So it's a long way to go down. But the spinal cord ends at L1 lower border. Now, when it comes to spinal nerves that are coming out through intervertebral foramina, C1 spinal nerves comes out between the occipital bone, skull base, and the atlas. Okay. In other words, it comes out above its respective vertebra. Okay, so this is its respective vertebra. It comes out above its respective vertebra. Then you get the C2, C3 like that coming out above its respective vertebra. Then C7 also come out through above C7. But since there's a C8 also, it comes out between C7 and T1. Comes out between C7 and T1. Therefore, T1 has to come out here. T1 has to come out between T1 and T2 vertebral bodies. So beyond that point, after C8, what happens is all thoracic spinal nerves, they come out immediately below its respective vertebra. So T8 below T1 below T1 vertebra, T2 below T2 is like that. Throughout it continues like that. That is one point. Then the second point is, even though the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column, the spinal nerves only come out through its respective intervertebral foramen, okay, which is below its respective vertebra. Now you can see, now because of the shortening of the spinal cord, when you go down, you can see that here T10 spinal nerve has to come down through the subarachnoid space up to down to T10 level. Okay, below T10 and T11 intervertebral foramen for it to come out. Okay, because it cannot come out through another intervertebral foramen like that. Okay, it has to come to its respective intervertebral foramen. So this is an important point. Okay. What happens is, below L1 level, you know that there is no spinal cord at all, but you have intervertebral foramina. Okay, intervertebral foramina between L1 and L2, L2 and L3, L3 and L4 like that. Then you have the sacral, anterior sacral foramina. So all the nerves that come out through these, all the nerves that come out after L1 segment, where the spinal cord ends here, they will have to travel down through without the spinal cord. Now, if this is your subarachnoid space, if your spinal cord ends there, all these nerve roots, sensory and motor nerve roots without the spinal cord, occupy this subarachnoid cistern, lumbar cistern. You remember we discussed about lumbar cistern the other day? So they will be bathed in cerebrospinal fluid in that area. When you do lumbar puncture, even though you don't do lumbar puncture high up because of the risk of damaging the spinal cord, you freely do lumbar puncture down here. It's like you cannot, if I give you a needle, can you put the needle through your hair and damage your hair? It's not possible. Okay, it's like splitting a hair with a needle. So if you try to put a needle inside, it will find its way and pass through without damaging this nerve root. They are slow, they are so small, and they will move around and give way to the needle. Okay, so there's no risk of doing lumbar puncture below the spinal cord. One student asked, that's why I'm explaining it all the time. Okay. So this passage of nerve roots, sensory and motor, below the spinal cord, it is like the tail of a horse. So you call it Cauda equina. Cauda means tail, equine is horse. Okay, Cauda equina. Okay. So here they come down and go out through its respective intervertebral foramina. Here it's the anterior sacral foramina. Okay, so this is an important point. Okay, so this is what happens. Okay, so you get all these nerve roots coming out like this, going down. Then the pyometer, at the point where the spinal cord ends, the pyometer forms a cord and continues down into the sacral region, getting attached there. Okay, and the dura and arachnoid also continues to the upper part of the sacrum around S2 level and stops there. Okay, so this continuation of the pyometer down is called phylum terminale. Phylum terminale. You can see that if you get access to the specimens when the faculty is opened again. Okay, in the specimens you can identify phylum terminale. And the other point is the nerve fibers, nerves in the Cauda equina below the spinal cord, they are purely motor or sensory nerves. Purely motor or sensory nerve roots. Okay, they are not mixed. They only get mixed before they leave at the intervertebral foramen, because I told you spinal nerves, whether the spinal cord has ended here or not, all the spinal nerves are formed inside the intervertebral foramina. Okay, until that, the nerve roots that are coming up to that level, however much it travels inside the subarachnoid space, they are pure. They are not mixed. Don't think that the spinal nerves are formed somewhere here and they come down and come out. Okay, spinal nerves are only formed at the intervertebral foramina. Then because of this discrepancy in the length of the vertebral column and the spinal cord, you can, as a rule of thumb, you can use how many, the number you have to add to the spinal segments to compare it or match it with the vertebral bodies. Now, for instance, say if you are talking about the spinal segment at the level of C3 vertebra, C3 vertebra, you to get that, if you want to get the spinal segment lying under cover of C3 vertebra, you have to add 1. Okay, so it is C4 roughly. Okay, this is what it means, this table. Then when it comes to upper thoracic, you have to add 2. Now, for instance, if somebody asks the spinal segment lying inside 5th thoracic vertebra, you have to add 2. So it's roughly, it's a rough assessment. Okay, rough calculation. It's T7 spinal segment under T5. Then lower 6th thoracic ones, you have to add 3. So if you say, for instance, if you say T8, at T8 level, you have T11 spinal segment. Then if you take the 10th, so that is only up to, sorry, T9. Okay. If you take the T10, there you get L1 and L2 spinal segments. Okay. Then T11, you can read it here. Then the 11th thoracic vertebra, you get L3 and L4. 12th thoracic vertebra, you get L5. Then the first lumbar vertebra, you get all sacral and coccygeal segments concentrated in one place. So if you damage the first lumbar vertebra in the vertebral column, if you damage the first lumbar vertebra fracture here, you have a chance of damaging all sacral and coccygeal segments, and they are the ones that supply your bladder, rectum, and all that. Okay, anal sphincters, all that. Okay, so then they can get paralyzed. So don't try to by heart this. Okay, but know that you can do something like this. Okay, you can do something like this. It's sometimes useful. Okay, knowing this is useful, but remembering is not very easy. Okay, so all the sacral and coccygeal segments are at L1 level because the spinal cord is not found beyond that. Okay. Then this concept of dermatomes and myotomes, you already know it. It is important to remember that before we go for the discussion later. Now, the dermatome, it's defined as an area of skin supplied by a single spinal nerve or spinal segment. Spinal cord segment is the same. whether you say spinal nerve or spinal cord segment. Then myotome is a muscle or part of a muscle supplied by a single spinal nerve or spinal cord segment. Okay, you know that. So then, so you can see a dermatomal map here. Okay, so your C4 is here and C5 and all that. You know that. Then now there is a concept called sensory level. Okay, when you do neurological examinations, if you examine a patient in the neurology wards or medical wards whom you think is having a neurological deficit, some problem with the nervous system, you look for their sensations using a toothpick or something that will not damage the patient, a sharp one. You look for pain. You use the pin to cause pain, and you ask the patient if he feels pain. You usually compare the two sides, this side and this side, same levels you will compare. If you check L5 here, you check L5 that side also at the same time. That then only you can compare one side in relation to the other side. Okay, it's a comparison always. Okay, then the sensory level is the most caudal. Caudal means most inferior. Intact dermatome for both pinprick and light sensations. So light touch is checked with some cotton wool. You take some cotton wool and you make a pointer from cotton wool, which is very delicate. Then you touch with the cotton wool. So that is for your touch sensations. Okay. So if both touch and pain are gone, say at L1 up to L1 level, it is all gone. Then your sensory level is T12, because the moment you go to T12 segment, the person starts feeling pain and touch. So it's intact. Okay, dermatome intact for both pinprick and light touch. Okay, so up to here it's lost. If you check like that in that direction, from downward to upwards, down to up, you will not have sensations up to here, but then beyond that point you will have sensations. So you get a sensory level, and it is the sensory level is a dermatome that you get. So that sensory level could be L2, then below L3 it's damaged there. Okay, it could be T10, which is the umbilicus level, then T11, 12 they are damaged. Okay, like that. All these are applicable to spinal cord injuries, because in the spinal cord, if you get the spinal cord like this, if you damage spinal cord, the whole throughout damage or one side damage, then below, all the nerve tracts coming down in that area will get damaged. So you get paralysis of that whole area in the limb. That's what it means. Okay. Now here, if you go by this table, why I put the table here, is that now say that a person fallen from height, even without an X-ray, say when you look for sensory level, say you get sensory level at T10, sensory level at say T9, a sensory level here T9. Okay, so T9 is intact. So T10 is intact up to T9. It is all lost sensation. T10 is intact. Okay. Then if you deduct 2 from T10, you get T6, that level. Okay. You get T6. So T6 is intact. T6 in the sense T6, T8 spinal segment is intact. Okay. So if you come to the vertebral column, T6 area, there is no injury, but injury is immediately below that. So roughly T7 vertebra could be the area that is damaged. Okay, due to that fracture or whatever, but you don't have to work it out that way. You can do an X-ray. Okay, the moment you do the X-ray, but at least when you do the X-ray, you should look for fractures in that T7 area of the vertebral column. Okay, because even a very slight fracture that is otherwise, undetected could be detected if you know where to look for. Okay, so it's not where to look for. Remember that point. It's important when we do nerve injuries later. Okay, this is another example of a spinal cord injury. Now here, this is a person, just try to read it. It says reduced sensations of temperature and pain on, now this is the right side. Right side, below a certain level, say umbilicus or something, you get pain and temperature lost on the right side. Then reduced sensation of 2-point discrimination, vibration and proprioception. So these are all going together, sensations. Those things are lost on the left side. And at the same time, immediately above that, on the left side, you get a zone of complete loss of sensations. Okay. So here on the body, on the left side, complete loss of both these ones, pain, temperature, and vibration, all gone on that side. Now, the reason is why, reason I told you when I did the previous part, the injury has damaged the sensory nerve roots at that level. This one is due to damage to the sensory nerve root. And these ones are due to damage to the ascending sensory nerve tracts in different areas. Okay. So this is what I mentioned when I did that part, complicates the picture. Okay. If you don't understand it now, you will just leave it. Okay, you will understand it later. Then a few injuries that you can actually see in. Now this is an MRI. This is an MRI of the cervical, vertebral column and the spinal cord. You can see the foramen magnum here, and you can see the this could be the this could be the axis. You see the dens here. So then this is C2, this is C3, and this is C4. Now this is C5. It's C5 that has been C4 of C5, or it's dislocated there, C4 and C5. Okay. Anyway, the injury is between C4 and C5. Now by this you can say that at that level it's roughly C5 or C6 spinal segments are there. C5 to 6 spinal segments are there in that area. So you get the damage in that area. Now you know that if you have your head, neck, and your trunk like this, your tip of the shoulder is C4, and arm, this part C5, and then you get C6 up to the middle finger. Middle finger is C7. So that area you can have sensory loss, C5, 6 area. Okay, if sensory tracts are damaged. And when it comes to motor, if motor is damaged, your biceps is supplied by C5 and 6. C5 and C6. Then all your shoulder muscles, short muscles of the shoulder, supraspinatus, intraspinatus, subscapularis, even deltoid, they are all supplied by C5 and C6 common segments. Okay, so they can be affected when it comes to muscle. Okay, so if you know your the anatomy stuff, you can work out a lot of things. Okay. Okay, this is another injury. This appears to be you see a vertebra here, a rib here. So maybe this is this should be T12, no? T12. If it is T12, it's not very clear. If this is T12, then this injury is between L1 and T12. This L1 is fractured. Can you see? This bone is fractured here. This is here, it's fractured. So it's L1 fracture in that case. So under L1, you get all your sacral and coccygeal segments. So you will get your bladder and everything paralyzed. Possible. Okay, they are all possibilities. Sometimes with the fracture, you might not get spinal cord damage if it is if you take precautions before it gets damaged. Okay, now this is a just to rough idea about at different levels of the spinal cord damage, how you get the loss. Okay, how you get the loss of paralysis and loss of sensations. If it is C4, like the one that we just showed, if the injury is C4, if we talk about sensory loss, you get sensory loss starting from the tip of the shoulders. Okay, now in this diagram, it's a through and through injury. Okay, the whole spinal cord is gone, not only one side. Okay, through and through injury. Transection of the spinal cord, complete. So your upper limbs have C5 to T1. So all upper limb, lower limb, trunk, all paralyzed, bilateral. Then C6 again, maybe, few shoulder muscles will be spared. And your tip of the shoulder sensation is intact because it's C4. Okay, because the injury is at C6. Then when it comes to T6, Then starting from the mid chest, somewhere in the mid chest, below you get all paralysis and weakness. Upper limbs will be spared since it is T6. Then even here the upper limb will be not spared there. So the L1 injury, then the one that I showed just before, you get paraplegia because you get all your fibers going down, damage because you get the lumbar and sacral ones supplying there. Okay. Only if the Cauda equina is damaged.